All right, today I'm going to be doing a video on tips for newer glide bait and swim bait fishermen, such as myself. I just really got into it in 2025. I took a few years off of fishing. I did throw a lot of this stuff, the smaller versions, a lot of these things, like up to 2 ounces, maybe 6 inches when I was younger, but never really got into the really big swim baits, and especially all of the skills and the knowledge that you need to really use these correctly. So this is from my perspective of what I've learned, some tips I can give other newer swim baiters, and also things I've learned through research and trial and error myself. Being that I'm newer, it does give newer people a little bit, in my opinion, more relevant information, just because people have been doing this forever. You kind of forget what it's like to be newer and maybe not be great at something because you've spent a ton of years doing it. You have really high-end gear, because that's the first thing I'm going to get into. Gear really does matter. You don't have to spend a ton of money, but you really can't go too cheap, especially when you start getting to these bigger baits, because it will affect the action and you're just not going to get what you want out of them. So first off, my first tip is going to be to use correct gear. Spinning gear really isn't recommended unless it's something that's smaller, around maybe an ounce or two. But really, you're going to be using bait casters for this. You're going to be using, for 2 ounces and under, you can get away with 150 size reels. You can even throw them on a jig rod, a spinnerbait rod, something like that, with you're working 17, 20-pound line. For 2 ounces and up, you're going to start getting into the realm of actual dedicated swim bait rods. So you're going to be using sizes 200 and up for reels, because you're going to be in that range of that 2 to 4. You're going to be using that 200 size reel, and then 4 ounces and up. I realize that the 300 size reel does make a difference. So me personally, I'm not going to be giving a ton of recommendations because this video is not for that. But this is just going to be what I've used and what's been working for me. So this is just a regular Dobbins Fury 795 SB, which is for swim bait. And this is a Daiwa Tatula 200. And I have 17-pound line on this. The line that I've been using has been this Seagar Abrasics. I use 17 and 20 pound. It's been working okay for me. No issues with it yet. And again, you're going to have to do your research, see what lines, try different ones out, see which ones work for you. So my other setup I've been working with are for the little bit larger. So this is a Mega Bass Levante Leviathan with a Daiwa Tatula 300. Also, Gomexis. These are the power handles. These are great. I like a bigger handle when you're working, especially these bigger baits. Gives you a little bit more of a grip, a little more control over it. So this rod is going to be up to that, that's 2 to 8 ounces what it's rated for. Realistically, 6 ounces, comfortably. 7 ounces I've thrown on it. It's not amazing, but it can handle it. Something along the lines of the size of that depth 250. And I'm throwing 20 pound on that as well. So another thing is experiment with line. I did notice that I started off, because I wasn't a fluorocarbon person prior to getting into this, some big game. I threw 20-pound big game on that setup for the first, portion of the summer. And honestly, in a lot of ways, I actually preferred it. It does allow you to keep the baits more shallow because it does float. So while you're newer to it, another thing that's going to be very relevant is seeing the bait. You're going to want to keep track of it because you don't have the confidence yet to really understand how the bait's moving in the water. So you're going to want to have that visual of really tracking that bait and seeing the movements and the inputs that you make with your rod and your reel. So having that line that floats does really help keep it shallow, so you're not wondering what it's doing under the water. So that's another big thing that I learned, that you really want to keep them more shallow until you really build that confidence to sink them down. Another thing is going to be the color. For me personally, I started off with a lot of, I don't want to say bright colors, but something of a bone, or this is it's called a bread color. This is more like a sunburnt bone. These get bit. They're super simple. You can see them in the water. You can see what they're doing. You can track them easily, and they're a little more visible to the fish. So there's nothing wrong with going natural, but a lot of these, they almost disappear in the water unless it's super clear water. So again, if you're not that confident with your baits, you're going to want to look at them and see what's happening with them. And so you're creating that visual image of when you do sink them down, or you're using maybe more stained water you're in. You can really start to understand what that thing's doing and what you want it to do, and you can communicate that to your bait. Getting into the baits. I'm not going to give a ton of recommendations. That's for a whole different video. But one thing I can say is do not overbuy when you're getting into this, especially these cheaper baits, because you're going to want to, broaden out a little bit and see what you like, because these are not like normal baits. They're not like your crankbaits or your jerk baits, where a lot of them are pretty in line with each other. You're going to notice a huge difference in the qualities and especially the materials that are used to make these baits. So like everyone, started off with an S-Waver, something small. You can throw this on traditional gear, and it's not bad. You're going to notice a huge difference. Obviously, when you step up, you start realizing just in size alone the difference. And again, with you start getting into resin baits, you'll realize how much different they react in the water. So that brings me to my next point: is going bigger starting out is actually better. It is easier to control. You can build better confidence with that. You might not think it, but throwing something like this is the Clutch Swimbait Company Boss. This is a big, 9 inches, 4 ounces. And throwing that as compared to something like this, it looks like this would be easier, but realistically, this is way easier to control. It's going to be more responsive in the water, and you can also feel what it's doing as you're reeling with the, in putting in some inputs with your rod tip. You can feel what that bait's doing. Even if you can't see it, you can still imagine under the water where it's going. So that's one thing about size. A lot of people are intimidated. It's really not that hard to throw these bigger baits, again, with the proper gear and the proper line, but the learning curve is easier with these bigger baits. So something to keep in mind, which should be pretty apparent, the longer the bait, as a depth 250, the longer the glide. So you get something like this Micro Boss, it doesn't take much to imagine that this is going to have much longer glides than this, because there's a lot more surface area. This is going to be a very wide sweeping when you're going, even on a straight retrieve. This is going to be very choppy. It's going to have very short movements. It's going to be very erratic. And again, a little more skill goes into doing that, but also it depends on the application, on if that's what you want and how fast you want that to sink. It all depends on a lot of different things. Water clarity too, depending on how high you want that in the water column. These are all things you're going to have to experiment with. Another thing is going on to the resin baits. They are going to sink generally at a slower rate. So they are nice for keeping towards the top. Again, something like this, they're very stable in the water. So as you're gliding, you're going to notice that they're really not sinking very much on a pause. A lot of just regular production baits are going to sink faster, and they're not going to be nearly as stable in the water, especially when they start to go fast. So that is something that when you try to overbuy in the beginning, you're going to realize that a lot of these cheaper baits, you might not prefer them. And now you're going to have 30, 40, 50 baits that you really don't touch. And these other baits, obviously they are more expensive, but if you're throwing that 9 out of 10 times, that to me is worth more the investment than having 20 or 30 of these baits that are around like $30, $40. So that gets me into my next point, is price. You're going to be paying a little more on average, well, actually a lot more than traditional baits. And you have to get over that, because that's part of the game. You can keep it on the cheaper side. You're not going to get as much out of it. Personally, I've thrown a couple different brands, not all of them, because obviously I've just gotten into it, but the resin especially just behaves so much differently in the water. And for glide baits and just maybe even the jointed baits, it's just a totally different experience, and you're really going to want to try those out. Maybe it might not be for you. You might not care that much, but you have to give it a shot. One of the easy things is you can go on to eBay or even Facebook Marketplace. You can buy some of these baits for sometimes half of what you can find them. These are going to range, most of these are going to be around like the $120 to $200 range, but you can find them for about half that, 60% of that, with a little bit of paint chipped off. Again, not a big deal, not a deal breaker. So there's no issues with buying a used bait. You can always get it repainted for very little cost. And again, it gives you that insight of how these are going to react differently. And you might like just the regular baits. You might not care about the resin, but there is definitely something to be said about these higher priced baits and how much better they are tuned. So another thing that comes with the higher priced baits, most will come with very good hardware. So generally they're going to come with like BKK, owner, split rings, same with the hooks. And these cheaper ones are going to come with mostly junk hardware. And you're going to want to switch those out, not just for the fact of possibly losing a fish, but also possibly losing the bait, because if you have a split ring, say on the nose here, and it's a cheap one, and that busts open just because it's old or because it's just bad quality, you're gonna be pretty disappointed in that when you could have changed it out for a couple dollars. And also, again, losing big fish, you don't want to have your hooks bend out, split rings getting opened up, and all it would take was a quick change out, and it's going to be 100% worth it, in my opinion. Another thing with losing baits, mono, don't overlook it. It's super cheap. It does work well. Another huge advantage of it, other than the fact it stays shallow, is that there's some forgiveness. So when you're whipping these baits, especially the big ones, there's going to be some stretch in the line. You're not going to have nearly as much pressure on that line or on that knot when you're really getting it out there, because the amount of force that you're going to have on the rod tip when you're at the apex of that, when you're releasing, you're going to have a lot more break-offs with fluoro or braid as opposed to mono that, again, has some forgiveness. Another thing is when you're setting the hook. Again, if you're not used to these baits, it's not a load up and a set. It's more of just you're reeling, you're gliding it, and you're just leaning into it. So that mono is forgiving if, let's say, you do set it super hard one of these times, got a big heavy bait on there, you're much less likely to break off, giving that mono has that stretch, as opposed to fluoro. It's going to have a lot more, it's going to have a much more abrupt stop when you go to set that hook. And another thing with buying these baits is, personally, you're going to make mistakes, and I like floating just because I have cast it off before, and you're in a kayak, you're in a boat, even if you're on the bank, you can get it back because you're sitting on top of the water. If you're getting a sinking bait, yeah, that thing's pretty much gone unless you really have the ability to go in the water, which most people don't. Another thing is tuning these baits. You're going to notice that changing out split rings and hooks are going to have a big effect on not only how it sinks, but also how it reacts in the water. So you're going to want to experiment with that and see. Also, there's the weight strips that people put on these to sink them down. Also, people wrap the wire. I'm not really a fan of that, but just keeping the same size hooks and going up a size, a 2X, a 3X, can really change the way that bait reacts in the water and sinks. So getting a floating bait, it's much easier to start high and way down. You get a sinking bait, you're never really going to be able to get that thing up higher in the water column without really doing some tuning, and possibly ruin your bait if you don't know what you're doing. Another thing is at the line connection. Split rings versus direct tie versus a snap, you're going to notice a pretty big difference in the action. It all comes down really to personal preference. For direct tie, you're going to have a lot more erratic. That bait is not going to be able to travel as far. It's going to start turning back on itself because it doesn't have that pivot point on the front. So again, if you're doing fast chops, that's not a big deal. But if you want to get a wider glide, that split ring does free it up. And again, a snap is going to really free it up because you're going to have all that extra space here when you're gliding it. That thing's not going to slow it down, and you're going to get much wider glides. A big thing to be said though about the snaps is you shouldn't be opening them up constantly to swap out baits. It's because it does weaken them over time. And actually, Mike Buca from Bullshad Swim Baits made a very good point about using split rings or snaps as opposed to direct tie. Is that you have these big baits. They're pretty heavy. So that knot, as you're gliding it back and forth, it's rotating. If you're doing a direct tie, you're going to have a lot more stress on that knot going back and forth. This does help alleviate a lot of that stress and put it on a split ring. And as he also mentioned, sometimes these here they can get small burrs. So that over time, that's going to cut into your line and possibly break off as well. So that's another thing just to be aware of. And I recommend you try all three. Some baits do not react well with a straight tie versus a split ring. I don't like some with split rings. To me, they don't mesh well. So it all depending on the style of the bait or the way you fish it, and even the line that you use, and maybe the current where you fish. If there's some current in it, maybe you want that direct tie. You have more control over that bait. It's a little more responsive. Lastly, I just want to quick talk about researching, getting information through YouTube channels, forums. There's a lot of different places online, Instagram, especially YouTube though. There's channels dedicated just to this, just to swim baits and glide baits. And you can learn a ton by watching not only what they're using and the gear they're using, but the way they're using it. You can watch their cadences, watch the way that they're working these baits, watch the way they land them, because that's a whole nother skill set right there. A lot of these channels, they have videos where they're posted weekly. Some recommendations I could give, it's like, Jeffrey the King, the Hookup Tackle, Tactical Bassin, Milliken Fishing, also like Clutch Swim Bait. They throw out a lot of good information. And these are all things you should take advantage of. That's where I gained a lot of my confidence by watching these guys, especially with these bigger baits, that you can catch fish. You don't have to be in these huge bodies of water. You can be in small ponds and still be successful with these baits. So that's going to wrap it up for today. I just wanted to give my 2 cents on my first year really dedicating to this style of fishing, and maybe help a few people that are going to be looking into it.